The Springboks will play Japan in the quarterfinals of the 2019 Rugby World Cup. That match happens on Sunday. It's a dream match for the Japanese public. It's a dream match for the tournament. I'm joined in studio once again by Rob Houwing. Morning, Rob.
Hello, Lloyd.
As amazing as Japan have been in this competition and amazing as the Japanese revolution has been over the years, this is definitely a scenario that the Springboks will take.
Absolutely, there's no question about that. I still see some contrary views, but make no mistake, I think deep down, and without them wanting to necessarily trumpet the game too much, because of course we know that can be a slightly sort of, a fatal sort of dynamic. It is a far better scenario. As we know, it happened sort of inadvertently in a sense. That loss to New Zealand right up front in Yokohama ended up being a blessing in disguise for the Springboks. The New Zealanders now have, a pretty tough route. We mustn't underestimate just how tough the South African route potentially still could be, because if they do succumb to any sort of complacency over the next couple of weeks, we all know that they could be on a flight home incredibly quickly. Yeah. We mustn't get too blasé about the way things have turned out. But yes, it is a great scenario. I almost think that Japan have had their sort of victorious final, mini-final in a sense, just by getting to the quarterfinals, by knocking over Scotland to ensure a really fantastic group performance from them. And I think that the Japanese bullet train comes to a grinding halt, quite frankly, come the quarterfinal against the Boks.
And we all know what happened in Brighton in 2015. And when you factor that in with how well Japan have gone at this tournament, I mean, one thing that's certain is that the players and the public will believe that it's possible. They're not going to go into any game anymore feeling that they're underdogs. I mean, there is a sense of belief that side seems to have at the moment.
Absolutely, you say belief, and belief is really a very key dynamic in that team. There's no question that they all play for each other. I've said from the start that there are no special superstars in that team. Although, you've got a few, especially among their outside backs. Fukuoka looks an absolute whiz. He looks like their version of Cheslin Colby on the wing, and of course that we might yet find that ends up being a little bit of a dream tussle in the quarterfinal. The Japanese side is still, I think, for what they do very well is they maximize their limitations. They know what their limitations are. They make no apology for them, and yet they do everything they can to ensure that their set piece is at least sort of reasonably functional or decent, rather than sublime. But I think that if the Springboks play to their full potential, especially in the sort of forward area, collisions, set piece, both scrum and line outs, driving mauls, etc., Japan are going to be under a heap of pressure in the quarterfinal. I'm already prepared to venture that I think South Africa would win the quarterfinal by more than one score. We haven't looked at the team lineups yet or know anything yet about the who's available, any injury doubts or last-minute curveballs, etc. But I'm going to say at this point that South Africa will take that game by more than one score. I'm that confident about the Springboks doing the job in the quarterfinal.
And we're speaking about knockouts, and now that we're in a quarterfinal, do we accept that we're not going to see as much running rugby as we maybe did in the pool stages, and that come Sunday, the Springboks will look to keep it as close and compact as possible and use their forwards to dominate the opposition?
Yeah, I don't think they'll depart too much. I know it frustrates a lot of people, but I still think that they're going to go for the contestable box kicks sort of game, on the assumption that they've got greater power and height in the contest. But of course, a lot will come down to Faf de Klerk, if in fact he stays as the first choice scrum half, of course, which I suspect he will. I don't think there's going to be wholesale dramatic changes now to the Springbok starting personnel. Rassie Erasmus has been pretty consistent with his selections, so I don't think there'll be too many curveballs in that department. I know a lot of people are saying that the Springboks should sort of try to open up a little bit more. I think from broken play, we all know that the Springboks will present a threat through the likes of Cheslin Colby, if fit, through the predatory sort of instincts of Makazole Mapimpi, perhaps running from deep at pace, etc., etc. But I do think that we're going to see the Springbok sort of wagon sort of rumbling, with those heavy oxen up front, unashamedly trying to muscle the Japanese into submission. And frankly, I think that the Springboks will be successful in that goal, whether people like it or not. We are talking knockout rugby, and knockout rugby in World Cups, you don't see too much in the way of pretty rugby. It's not about sort of risk taking, little quick sort of tap penalties and so on. It's about sort of hogging the territory, hogging the possession, sucking the life out of teams, and I don't think the Springboks will change very significantly at all from their sort of what they call their sort of tried and trusted method of sort of domineering, if you like.
Is getting away on the scoreboard early important in this game? Because these games where there's a bit of an underdog, the closer they are for longer, the more nervy it gets. I mean, is there a situation if you get to the hour mark and there's 2 points in it, then anything's possible? Is it important for the Boks to put distance between them and Japan as early as possible?
Yes and no. I think just from a plain common sense point of view, yes. I mean, obviously you don't want to go 14 points behind. Interesting, of course, that Scotland actually went 7-0 up in the sort of the group decider on Sunday, and I'd actually foolishly, it turns out, I'd actually backed Scotland for a narrow win. Got that wrong, and I was very happy to take the hit. The Springboks have shown under Rassie Erasmus that they've got the composure to come back from a long way behind. Think of those games that they played last season in his first year in charge against England, where South Africa twice, I think, in that series went quite significantly behind early on, and yet still had the sort of the composure and the wherewithal to actually to come from behind. So we know that this Springbok team culturally can do the job of coming from behind. I think from a conditioning point of view, they're in a good space, right up there with the Japanese, who are among the best conditioned teams of the tournament in their own landscape. And of course, yes, if the Boks go quite significantly ahead early on, that will be a very good portent, because then I think the Springbok pack strength will come into play, and gradually the life will be sucked out of Japan. So, either way, I wouldn't be that concerned if the first 20 minutes shows a particular sort of trend on the scoreboard either way in the contest, because I still think that come the 80-minute mark, South Africa will have come out on top.
And then, Rob, if South Africa win their quarterfinal on Sunday, they obviously play the winner of France and Wales in the semi-final. And again, if you just look at the pool, the makeup of the quarterfinals, the fact that they've avoided England, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand on the other side of the draw, again, a bit of a situation similar to 2007 when they played Fiji in the quarters and Argentina in the semis on their way to the final. But if you had told the Springboks before the tournament that this would be their path to the final, they would absolutely snap it up.
For sure. There are certain comparisons with 2007. I suppose we have to be a little bit careful, not forgetting the fact that Wales have slightly had South Africa's number, quite unpleasantly, in fact, in the last few years. You may remember that up to a few years ago, South Africa overwhelmingly dominated Wales, and then Wales suddenly started winning games against South Africa far more routinely than the South African public would like. And that's something that will give the Welsh some real belief. Let's not forget that they are the Six Nations champions, although in a pretty tight competition. And I don't think Wales have necessarily looked like world champions so far in the World Cup from what I've seen of them. But they are to be respected. It's just possible, of course, that they will really hit their straps come the knockout phase. So I'm not underestimating Wales for 1 second. France, as we know, if South Africa do end up playing the French, we will know that the French have probably thrown the kitchen sink quite valiantly in their quarterfinal if they've upset Wales. It would be a minor upset if that's what happens. But then we know the French. That means their heroics perhaps are then done and dusted. And by the time they hit the Springboks in a semi-final, you would imagine that the Springboks would in turn have their number. So. Not the worst scenario for the Springboks. If, for instance, it was to be Japan and France en route to whoever they then play in the final, it wouldn't amount to the most stressful of build-ups for them.
And just looking ahead to the three other quarterfinals, Rob, three clear favourites there as well. New Zealand to beat Ireland, England to beat Australia, Wales to beat France. Do you think there will be any upsets in those three matches? I mean, it's possible that any of those sides could knock over their more favoured opposition on the day?
Absolutely. Given a really desperate performance by one of the, as you say, sort of marginal underdogs, if you like, in those games, it is possible. But the route you've suggested in wins terms is pretty much what I'd go with. I do think England will have the physicality to be able, and the sort of strategic nous under Eddie Jones, to be able to subdue the Wallabies. Although, at times I've been quite impressed by the Wallabies in the tournament. Not sort of enduringly, but at times they've played some pretty decent rugby.
Yeah.
They are dangerous, but I think England will get through that one. A lot of people are saying that Ireland could knock over the All Blacks. I don't think Ireland have adjusted very well to the conditions in Japan. I think that the All Blacks will have a little bit more air in their lungs, as well as their by reputation. I still think that the All Blacks go in as pretty solid favourites. Not saying that Ireland can't win. They have, of course, beaten the All Blacks a couple of times in recent years, which will give them a strong sense of hope. They have some amazing individuals in that Irish team who are capable, including South Africa's own CJ Stander, of course, who's become quite a core component of their loose forward dynamic. And they've got enough individuals to really bother the All Blacks. But I still have a feeling the All Blacks will, at the very least, march on to the semis. And then, as we've discussed, Wales, France. You'd think it'll be Wales, but with the French, on a really sublime day, capable of an upset. But I wouldn't be putting too much money on that one.
And then now that the pool stages are over, I just wanted to get your thoughts on the products as a whole and the overall tournament. We've obviously lost 3 matches because of the Super Typhoon. Is there anything that the organisers could have done differently to accommodate those 3 games? I know it's difficult to answer that from over here, but just from the outside looking in, I mean, does that speak to poor organisation, or is it just one of those things that you can't control?
I think it's a bit of both. I don't think we should underestimate, the power of nature. You have to be careful not to be too sort of blasé about saying that it caught World Rugby napping, because a super typhoon is more than just a typhoon, and a typhoon within itself. I know from my living in Hong Kong days, a typhoon is not to be messed with, and this was a super typhoon which caused mass deaths and some very significant destruction as well. So you can't be too sort of blasé about that. But I do also think that perhaps World Rugby were caught a little bit with their pants down in terms of potential sort of counter logistics, a plan B, which didn't really come into play. I don't think it's great for any World Cup that you have situations where a rugby match, doesn't happen. Even if it was to happen, even if certain games were played behind closed doors because of the issue of getting spectators, 50,000 or 60,000 spectators safely to a venue. I think it's perhaps a little bit easier to think about perhaps shifting a game, and even if it's played to a mass television audience the world over in an empty stadium, it's not unprecedented for that sort of thing to happen, just to ensure that the game gets played. Yeah. And I think that for future World Cups, wherever they're played, you may find they're played in countries where you don't have such an issue with sort of natural climate phenomenon, and so on. But so it's disappointing that a few games went astray. Some of them probably not particularly relevant to final outcomes. That's at least a comfort. And I'm just so glad that Japan-Scotland game happened. Because if that game hadn't taken place, there would have been just that little question mark always about, were Japan really worthy quarterfinalists? We now know that they were, and that was a fantastic development. So the World Cup has retained 99% of its credibility, despite the natural disaster. Hopefully now we have plain sailing weather-wise. I would think we probably will for the rest of the tournament.
And then just the other point, I wanted to talk a bit about the Tier 2 nations. The World Cup is inclusive, and part of its appeal is that it accommodates these Tier 2 teams. And you'd like to see the gap between Tier 2 and Tier 1 closing with every World Cup. There weren't really any major upsets at this tournament. Japan beating Ireland in the pool stage is probably the biggest. Japan arguably now a Tier 1 nation. Yeah. Just in terms of that gap between Tier 1 and Tier 2, have you seen it close, or has it remained the same over the last 4 years?
No, I think it has closed. I think you've had some of the minnow teams being more competitive for longer. And some teams have really had their moments. Uruguay have had, if not necessarily a full match, but some really sublime sort of halves or half-hour periods against sort of more top-notch opposition, and a couple of other teams along the way as well. Yes, there have been certain disappointments. The US, for instance, at least on paper, don't look as though they've developed as much as some people might have anticipated in the last 4 years. Although they've also had some elements of bad luck along the way, but generally you didn't get the sense of some absolute cricket school matches. Let's think back to '95 when Japan lost to the All Blacks. The All Blacks put 145 points on them. That's not a healthy development. You haven't had anything like that at this World Cup, and that's got to be a good thing. It is a sign that the gap is closing, and I never got a sense that you had some really painful mismatches at this tournament, and it was good for the development of the smaller nations that they were able to at least keep pace, even if it was only for 15 or 20 minutes of certain matches, were able to at least keep pace to a degree with their sort of much superior foes. That obviously stands them in good stead developmentally, looking ahead to the next World Cup and the ones beyond that. So I think generally lots to be positive about when it comes to the sort of minnow countries.
And just finally, Rob, I just want to talk about that Springbok break, because by the time they play their quarterfinal, they will have had nearly 2 weeks off. We've seen images over the weekend of them, the team hanging out at the Japanese Formula One Grand Prix and having a good time. Is there a danger that they'll be undercooked for this, or is that kind of break something that was needed to kind of recharge the batteries?
I think it was actually a good break. I think especially considering the stifling humidity, the quite challenging conditions in Japan, sometimes having a little bit more of a break than you almost anticipated is perhaps going to not amount to such a bad thing. I think the Boks will still be ready to hit the ground running. I think most of them are in an excellent state of sort of physical well-being. The Boks haven't been too badly affected by injuries at the World Cup. Touch wood. I mean, hopefully that stays that way for the next 2 or 3 weeks. And I don't think that they'll even perhaps. If the first 5 or 10 minutes Japan throw the kitchen sink at the Boks, I wouldn't be too surprised if that happens. But South Africa's defensive systems, if they hold, should be able to repel that. And then I think the Boks will gradually refine their lungs as that game develops. I don't think they're going to get caught short from a conditioning point of view or a motivational one, because I think Rassie Erasmus is quite a neurotic sort of planner. I think he will have drummed into the guys just how important it is from here that they are, this maximum focus for 80 minutes, all the way to that through that sort of dream aspiration of the final.